This is Chapter 3 of Lord of the Flies.
Spoiler's gonna make y'all stop. Take a minute and remember who takes the top. To the critics and the cynics, your time is up. Just admit it and rewind it, but this rhyme is up. It's hot. Spoiler's gonna make y'all stop. Take a minute and remember who takes the top. To the critics and the cynics, your time is up. Just admit it and rewind it, but this rhyme is up.
We are back again. This is, as mentioned, Chapter 3 of Lord of the Flies. And as you can tell, I've got some different lighting, so it's not as dark as the last video. And I'm also wearing a dress shirt. And it's really, really cold in my basement. So I've got my coffee this time to help to keep me warm, since I've decided to forego the sweater. In any case, we're gonna continue on, right? We're gonna forge on. We don't know how long this online thing is gonna go for, so this is the way it's gonna be. And so, as always, have your stuff in front of you. You should have your own notes by now. Again, you should have maybe my PowerPoints in front of you so that you can follow along. Maybe the novel in front of you. I think I'll be referencing at least one page from the chapter today, so you can have that in front of you. Maybe the course pack in front of you. In any case, have the resources. By now, we are maybe close to a week in to our online education, and hopefully you have found yourself in a bit of a groove. And you're finding it a little bit easier as the days go on. And if not, and I can be of help to you in some way, then you know how to reach out to me. And please make sure that you let me know, right? So we can do this together. And nobody should feel like they have to do this by themselves. So it may seem like that because everyone's in their respective homes. But please let me know if I can be of help in any particular way. So let me pull up the PowerPoint here, and let's get right into it. So as always, the PowerPoints will show up here, and you can follow along. And so with this chapter, there's not really a heck of a lot going on. I would say probably the two biggest takeaways from this chapter, this is your first couple of notes here. The two big takeaways from this chapter is really what's starting to happen to Jack as a character. And he's starting to really lose sight of what's important. And so we'll talk about that when we get there. And then the second really big takeaway, I would say, is right at the end of the chapter, we get a little bit more insight into the kind of person that Simon is. And Simon is a really, really interesting character. He'll probably end up being your favorite character by the end of all of this. And so we want to kind of start keeping track. And if you want to in your notes, I would highly suggest you do this, is to start keeping track in your notes of the kinds of things that Simon says and does. And he really doesn't say a whole lot, but when he does speak, it's very meaningful. But really he allows the kind of person that he is to show through his actions. So he would be an interesting one if we ever had to do a steel chart on somebody. He'd be an interesting one to do a steel chart for, because he's a well-rounded character. In any case, we'll talk about that when we get there. So let's get right into it. Chapter 3 is called Huts on the Beach, which, very much like Chapter 2, gives us an indication of what their next steps are going to be. So where we left off, of course, in Chapter 2 is with the death of the boy with the mulberry-colored birthmark. The fire grows out of control. The older boys aren't keeping track of the younger boys, and so we have this accidental death of a little one, which is so sad. So that's how Chapter 2 ended. In Chapter 3, with Huts on the Beach, you can imagine that their next step is going to be building shelter. And before we transition into that scene with Ralph, I just realized I don't have my glasses on. No wonder I couldn't see so well. Before we transition to that scene with Ralph building the huts, is as soon as the chapter begins, we are privy to what Jack is doing. And what Jack is doing is Jack is hunting, practicing his hunting skills. So if you remember well enough, at the end of chapter 1, when on the mountaintop, or leaving the mountaintop, Jack, Ralph, and Simon encounter a trapped piglet, to which Jack hesitates. He pulls out his sheath knife, and he hesitates in killing the trapped piglet. It eventually frees itself and escapes. And Jack is slightly embarrassed with himself for allowing his sensitivity, his connection to back home, his civility to take over and not allow him to kill it. And so the narration says to us at the end of chapter 1, next time there will be no mercy. And so perhaps maybe foreshadowing an event to come. But anyways, this chapter begins with describing Jack being bent double, down like a sprinter. And what he's doing here, as you can see on the PowerPoint, is he's practicing his hunting skills, which again is not a bad thing. So I'll put that out there in terms of getting to understand Jack, that if in chapter 1 he is, or at least has designated himself and his choir group to be hunters, then this is in everybody's best interest for him to be practicing those hunting skills, right? If he's going to be able to provide for everybody. So this is not a bad thing. What ends up kind of being bad about it is that what Jack has decided to do, which we find out in a few pages, is he has decided to send the rest of his hunters back to, essentially back to the platform and back to the swimming pool and so on, to kind of have fun while he continues on to practice those skills, which we find out in a few pages that Ralph doesn't appreciate. The main point being that if Jack is going to practice his hunting skills, his entire choir should, not just him. So, this is not necessarily a bad thing. He's doing a good thing here. When Jack becomes too tired, he's unsuccessful, by the way, he's tracking this one pig, and he's unsuccessful at killing it, is he returns back to Ralph. And Ralph and Simon are here trying to fashion together leaves and twigs and so on in order to build shelter. So Jack approaches both Ralph and Simon and asks for water. And Ralph directs him over to these coconut shells that are filled with water and lying in the shade in order for them to kind of keep cool. And Jack goes over and he splashes his face with it in order to cool off and to rehydrate. And when I say that Jack is starting to lose focus in this chapter in terms of what's important, Jack and Ralph in this chapter really get into their first real argument. And so I want to make sure that in your notes you understand where both of these boys are coming from in terms of their argument against each other and this debate that's going to go back and forth, and it lasts for a few pages. I'll give you Ralph's side of the argument first. Ralph's side of the argument is very, very simple, which is that no one is helping except for Simon, but generally no one is really helping Ralph build the shelters. And so the work is incredibly hard on him alone, and Simon is really hard on them alone, and so nothing's really getting done. And so one of the key lines from this chapter is from Ralph, where he says that, or at least it's narrated to us, that they are working on shelter number 3, and the first one's okay because everyone kind of helped build it, therefore it's a little bit more stable. The second one is less stable, and this third one is, as it says, is in ruins because fewer and fewer boys are actually helping to build it. And so really, Ralph's argument is no one is really helping. And again, as we had discussed in chapter 2, there's a balance between fun and responsibility, as we talked about. The passionate noise of agreement hit Ralph like a wave, that whole scene. And already we start to see the breaking up of that, where boys would rather have fun, rather than do the responsible thing. And so again, Ralph's point is that nobody's helping. The boys are off swimming and playing and doing other things, and the work is incredibly hard. Jack's rebuttal to that is that it's not Jack's responsibility to help with those kinds of things. So Jack makes it very clear to Ralph, well, my responsibility is to hunt, right? Is to practice hunting. And so this kind of debate goes back and forth. I think both boys are right with their respective arguments. But then Ralph responds to Jack by saying, that's all fine and good. The point being, though, that you actually enjoy hunting, right? So for Jack, that's not a chore, where building shelters is a chore for Ralph. And also, Ralph makes a valid argument to say, well, your hunters came back hours ago, and they're swimming, as opposed to coming back hours ago and at least helping Ralph with the shelters. To which Jack again responds by saying, my hunters shouldn't be responsible for helping with a task such as building shelters. They have their own responsibility. So this kind of argument goes back and forth between both of these boys. Ralph needs the help. He needs everybody's help. Jack feels like that's not his responsibility, nor is it the responsibility of his hunters. And so that kind of goes back and forth. At one point, what do I have here on this slide? Ralph tries to convince Jack that more people need to help. Yes, of course. And as I've put up here on the slide, is that injustice number 3, again, you don't have to keep track of what's injustice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It doesn't really matter all that much. But Ralph makes the point here to say, all I've been doing is working with no one but Simon, and it's simply not enough. So as a side note here, at some point in this chapter, and you'll have to kind of go back to find out which page it is, but at some point during this chapter, Simon goes off on his own. And I want to say it's around this time where Ralph and Jack's argument becomes a little bit more heated. And Simon just kind of leaves. So he's helping Ralph build the shelters, and at a certain point, he just kind of sneaks off. And that's going to be important for a little bit later, because what we come to learn about Simon is that he is somebody who really needs to get away in order to sort of feel a sense of peace. And so I'll just leave it at that, and we'll talk about that when we get there. I'm hungry. That's a chocolate chip hot cross bun from Cobb's Bakery. Delicious. Give me a sec. So good. Perfect. So, where the argument gets a little bit more heated between Jack and Ralph is when, as you can see here on the slide, represented by Ralph, is Jack's, again, kind of justifying why it is that he shouldn't have to help with the shelters. Again, Jack kind of reiterates, but, I'd rather hunt. We need meat. As I think Jack repeats a few times, we need meat. And so he says, I thought I might kill. I thought I might do it this time. And the response from Ralph, as you see on the slide here, is, but you didn't. And that, I think, really kind of sets Jack off a little bit, because he gets incredibly defensive. Back is up against the wall. What are you accusing me? You're accusing me for not being successful at doing my job. And so I think this is the point where Simon kind of leaves and kind of goes off and does his own thing. So the argument is a little bit, it becomes a little bit more heated, because Jack feels like maybe Ralph is blaming him for for not doing his job properly, or being unsuccessful at getting the boys meat. And to Ralph's point, what he's saying is, if you're not catching meat, or you're not getting us meat, then you should be helping. Then you should be helping with other things, like building the shelters. And that is I don't know if this happened in the first video, but anytime that I get texts or anything like that, I get super distracted. And so it's not just students. It's adults too that get distracted with that kind of stuff. Anyway, that was a friend of mine. Yesterday it was my birthday, which I noticed that none of you wished me a happy birthday, and it's fine. Am I upset? Yes. Should you have messaged me? Yes. Is it the end of the world? No. But I just noticed that none of you messaged me, and my very best friend, he was the best man at my wedding, he did not message me yesterday to wish me a happy birthday, so that's him apologizing, and I'm not even going to answer it. I'm going to let him stew on it a little bit. I'll message him later and give him heck for it. All right, moving ahead. Just a few more things here, and then we're almost at the end. So, like I said, Jack is becoming he's becoming a bit of a different person, and his obsession with hunting is becoming a little bit too aggressive. It's becoming a little bit too much, and it's starting to kind of consume his life a little bit. And so, as I'm sure you've noticed, right, is that Jack and Ralph's perspective on what's necessary, it's starting to kind of go off in two different directions here. Again, the focus for Ralph is we have to do the responsible things in order to stay alive so we can eventually be rescued. And for Jack, it's hunting, providing meat. The boys need meat, right? And so those are the two different perspectives. And what Jack says here is he says, if you're hunting, this is from Jack, if you're hunting, sometimes you catch yourself feeling as if you're not hunting, but actually being hunted, like something is watching you all the time. And this is actually kind of a vulnerable set of lines from Jack, which we wouldn't really expect knowing his character, that he's actually admitting sometimes that when he's out in the forest and hunting, practicing those hunting skills, that he feels like he's being watched. And this is a very, very, very brief reference to the idea of a beast or a snake thing being out there in the forest. And so I thought I'd just bring this up because it's just a very vulnerable moment from Jack, which we're not privy to very often. A couple more things here. On page 51, I just thought I would make note of this. If you go back a couple of pages, depending on if you're following along, on page 51, there's an interesting thing here from Ralph that he mentions. And he's starting to, what Ralph mentions is he says, oh, meetings. Don't we love meetings? We love having these kinds of assemblies and things like that to meet together and discuss. And what Ralph is kind of saying to Jack is that these meetings are starting to lose their... the meetings are starting to lose their meaning. And so what Ralph kind of says is, everybody has these great ideas. Let's build a TV or a submarine or, whatever. Everybody has these, these grand ideas, but the follow through just isn't there. And if I have to make some sort of a connection to your lives, what I said on one of the first days of class is, it's nice to say you want 90%. It's nice to say you want to get an average that's above an 85. And it's nice to say those things, but to actually have the work ethic in order to achieve that, that's something very different. And so it's the same thing, what Ralph is saying here, that it's nice to say those things, that everybody wants to achieve those really, really grand goals, but the follow-through isn't there. And so that's just a brief thing, again, from Ralph that he mentions to say, like, hey, we need to be working a little bit harder here. And we're going to come back to that because, without giving anything away, Ralph, by the time Chapter 5 rolls around, it's going to require him to kind of refocus the boys and get them back doing the things that are necessary in order for them to stay alive. So that was one thing that I wanted to mention. So getting towards the end here, I know I keep saying I just have a couple of things, and this time I mean it. I just have a couple of things. Getting towards the end of the chapter, Jack, like I said, his obsession with hunting, it's becoming just a little bit, it's becoming too aggressive, and it's really starting to take over his, his mental space. And as you can see on the slide here, I thought that this was a really important kind of back and forth between Jack and Ralph. And when Ralph reminds Jack about responsibility and going home, the line says, rescue. This is from Jack. Rescue. Oh, yes, of course, all the same, but I'd like to catch a pig first. So Ralph's response is, well, so long as your hunters remember the fire. And then Jack's response is, you and your fire. And so this is important because, again, as I said, that their thought process, it starts to kind of, go off in different directions here, because even though it's really Jack's responsibility as well as his hunters to keep the fire going, which it is, on top of hunting, is he says, you and your fire, which means that Jack is kind of sick and tired of Ralph reiterating the idea of a fire. And I suppose my point is, and this is, I guess, the part that you can write down, is that if Jack starts to not value the fire, then his hunters will also not value the fire. And then, of course, you can imagine what would happen after that. No one's going to care for it. No one's going to care if it's still burning or not. And the fire will eventually burn out. And we already talked about in the first video for Chapter 2 how important the fire really is. So it is really important for Ralph to keep reiterating the importance of the fire. But already by Chapter 3, Jack is starting to believe that it's not really all that important. And again, it shouldn't escape you that Jack's line here where he says, rescue. Oh, yes, of course, rescue. Yes, of course we want to go home, but I want to catch a pig first. It shouldn't escape you how unbelievably odd that is. By Jack's logic, if a ship or a plane were to dock on the island at that moment, ready to take the boys home, by Jack's logic, he would say, okay, well, I'm not quite ready yet. I really want to catch a pig first before I go home. Right, by his logic. So that really shows you that his perspective on what's important, his mental state is not fixated on going home. It's about catching a pig. So just you should have in your notes there that he is incredibly obsessed with catching a pig. I think he really wants to make sure that what happened at the end of Chapter 1 with the piglet getting away doesn't happen again. And this is the final thing, I promise. As I mentioned, we're going to get a really good indication of the kind of person that Simon is. And you should start keeping track of the things that Simon says and does. Because, as I mentioned, Simon finds a good opportunity to leave Jack and Ralph in the middle of their argument and go off on his own. And the significance of this is, and this is what you can add to your notes, is that as Simon is going off on his own, as he kind of worms his way into the forest, and he's followed by some of the little kids. And they kind of grab Simon and they lug him over towards the fruit trees. And they're pointing, wanting to be fed. They want Simon to reach up because he's one of the bigger boys. He's an older boy. Knowing that Simon can reach some of the better fruit up top, is they want Simon to feed them. And so he does, is he picks the fruit from up top and he's passing it down to the outstretched hands of the little ones. And one of the key words here is that they look at him inscrutably. The little kids look at Simon inscrutably. And if you look up what that means, it means that they look at him. This is such an important scene, and someone just flushed the toilet. So it means that they look at Simon in such a way as to indicate that they don't quite understand why he's helping, right? So they're looking at him like, why are you helping us? And the reason why they look at him like this is because no one else has so far. No one else has helped them so far. No one else is really looking after them. And so when Simon actually takes the time to help these young boys, they kind of look at him in a really confused way. So that's one thing that Simon does that is really, really positive. And also it, of course, shouldn't escape you that Simon, out of all the boys, is the only one to stick around and help Ralph build the shelters when everyone else has left. So there are a few things to add to Simon's character. When Simon does kind of leave the younger boys to eat, and he goes off on his own, he finds a place in the woods, and you can call this Simon's Clearing. That should be your note, because I'm going to keep referencing it for pretty much the rest of the novel. Simon's Clearing is a place that Simon finds. It's, as you can read in the text, it's a very, very beautiful place. There are butterflies dancing. It's not too hot. It's quite comfortable. He can sit. And as we experienced at the end of chapter 1 with him wanting to just smell the flowers on the mountaintop before Jack, of course, cuts into them, is he really just wants to sit, be on his own, reflect, be at one with nature, enjoy his surroundings. And he wants, and as you can imagine, that it's his escape. It's his place away from the arguing, first of all, of Ralph and Jack, and a place where he can kind of be left alone with his thoughts. So Simon, as a 12-year-old boy, is a pretty deep character. Someone who is very, very, first of all, I would say mature for his age. Someone who certainly so far has been making the right decisions in terms of the things that he does. And here we just have a really, really beautiful scene that chapter 3 ends with him kind of sitting in his clearing, just kind of sitting there and connecting with his surroundings. And I'll just leave it at that, because as we continue on in the novel, we will add things to our list for Simon. So please don't forget about him. And it'll be tough not to, and it'll be tough to forget about him anyway. But have a page set aside that you can constantly find and go back to, because we will continue to add things to that list. So that's chapter 3. And as always, I'll continue repeating, if you need me, just reach out. You know how to do that. I hope the video was helpful. And there goes the toilet flush again. And let me know if you need me. See you soon.